The corridor outside the West Nursery was never silent during evening rotation, yet the monitoring tablet in the Royal Guard's hand showed a live feed with no assigned escort on duty. One entry in the movement log was missing entirely. The guard stopped, listening. From behind the closed nursery door came the faint, uneven sound of a child crying, but the duty roster said the room should have been empty. The nursery corridor was unusually quiet for that hour, the kind of quiet that did not feel restful but suspended, as if normal movement had paused without explanation. Senior Royal Guard Thomas Hale noticed it first in the air itself, the absence of the soft murmur of attendants and the faint movement that usually carried through the heavy paneled doors. His boots slowed on the polished floor, the sound of each step returning to him in a faint echo that should not have been there. The duty roster in his memory was precise. 2 nursery attendants and a rotating escort officer were scheduled until the afternoon changeover. The door to the nursery stood slightly open, not enough to signal alarm at a distance, but enough to be irregular. Hale rested a gloved hand against the wood and pushed gently, careful not to let the hinges sound. Inside, the room was filled with the pale winter light of mid-morning, filtered through tall curtains that softened the edges of the furniture and cast long, muted shadows across the carpet. The quiet was broken by a small, uneven sound, the restrained, intermittent breathing of a child trying not to cry. Prince George sat near a low table, his back turned, shoulders tight, one hand clenched around the sleeve of his sweater as if holding himself steady. There was no attendant nearby, no escort by the door, no sign of anyone who should have been responsible for him. Hale felt the immediate trained pull of protocol, the rule that his assigned post in the West Corridor required him to report irregularities before intervening in areas outside his direct sector. But the sound of that restrained breathing carried across the room with a clarity that made the rule feel distant, almost theoretical. He stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind him, not fully, but enough to create a sense of enclosure and safety. He kept his movements measured, his posture calm, lowering himself to one knee at a respectful distance so that his presence would not startle the boy. The prince did not look up at first, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly, sensing another person nearby. Hale spoke softly, only enough to acknowledge his presence and offer reassurance without intrusion, and after a moment the child's breathing steadied, the tightness in his posture loosening just enough to show that the immediate distress was passing. Hale allowed the silence to settle again, controlled and calm, while his mind moved quickly through the implications. An unattended child in a secured royal nursery was not a minor lapse. It was a break in the chain of responsibility that palace security was built upon. Without drawing attention, he pressed the concealed alert tab inside his cuff, transmitting a low-priority welfare signal that would reach the duty desk without triggering public alarms. The response would be discreet, but it would begin a trace of movements and logs. He remained where he was, watching the boy carefully, listening to the faint sounds of the palace beyond the walls, and realizing that no footsteps were approaching, no attendant returning in haste, no indication that anyone yet knew the child had been left alone. Minutes passed with a slow, deliberate wait, each one lengthening Hale's unease rather than easing it. The prince had moved to sit beside a window, calmer now, watching the pale movement of clouds beyond the glass, but the absence of staff had become more troubling with time, not less. Hale maintained his quiet presence, careful not to crowd the child, while his attention remained fixed on the subtle details that training had taught him never to ignore. A small tray near the reading chair held a cup of tea gone cold, the surface filmed over, suggesting it had been left untouched for longer than a brief interruption. One of the nursery logs lay open on a side table, the last entry written in neat handwriting noting a scheduled escort transfer nearly 20 minutes earlier. Hale knew the escort assigned to that shift, punctual, methodical, not someone who would abandon a post without cause. The alert response in his earpiece came at last, a faint vibration indicating acknowledgement but no immediate explanation, which meant the duty desk itself was likely still trying to locate the missing personnel. Hale felt the quiet pressure of time building, the awareness that every passing minute without clarity deepened the seriousness of the lapse. He rose and moved slowly through the room, not searching in a way that would disturb the child, but observing, noting the absence of a secondary attendant's coat, the lack of any sign of hurried departure, the unsettling orderliness that suggested the room had been left deliberately, not in emergency. From the corridor beyond the door came the distant sound of footsteps, then silence again, as if someone had approached and turned away. Hale felt the first distinct edge of resistance forming, not open or confrontational, but subtle, the kind that appeared when inquiries began to make people uncomfortable. A second signal reached him, this one more direct. Temporary staffing adjustments were being verified, and he was instructed to remain in place until clarification arrived. The wording was precise, formal, and gave no explanation. Hale looked toward the prince, now quietly turning the pages of a picture book, his earlier distress fading but not forgotten, and understood with growing certainty that the issue before him was no simple scheduling error. Someone had authorized changes that left a child unprotected, and the system that should have corrected the error quickly was moving with an unusual hesitation. Hale stepped back toward the door, listening to the muttered stillness of the corridor, and for the first time considered the possibility that the absence of supervision was not an accident at all, but the visible surface of something deeper moving beneath the routines of the palace. The first attendants arrived nearly 12 minutes after Hale's alert, their composure controlled, but their expressions strained in a way that did not escape his notice. They moved efficiently, one kneeling beside the prince with gentle reassurance, while the other began restoring the ordinary rhythm of the nursery, but neither could explain the absence that had preceded them. Hale stepped back into the corridor to allow their work to continue, closing the door softly behind him, and felt the shift in atmosphere immediately. The corridor was no longer empty. Two administrative staff members stood farther down the passage, speaking in low voices, their conversation stopping the moment he noticed him. Training had taught Hale to observe without appearing to observe, and he registered the small details, the way one of them folded a tablet screen closed too quickly, the brief exchange of glances, the decision to leave without approaching him. At the security post adjoining the corridor, Hale requested access to the movement logs for the previous hour, presenting the request in the calm, formal manner expected of a senior guard. The officer on duty hesitated only a fraction of a second before complying, but that hesitation was enough to deepen Hale's concern. The digital log displayed the scheduled custody handoff at 10:10, transferring responsibility from the morning attendants to a midday escort. A second entry at 10:14 confirmed arrival of the escort officer. Both entries were properly formatted, properly time-stamped, and appeared, at first glance, entirely routine. Yet Hale had walked that corridor at 10:20 and heard no voices, no footsteps, no movement consistent with a staff transition. He requested the camera playback for the same interval. The officer at the console began the retrieval, but the screen returned a brief notification, signal interruption, duration 3 minutes and 40 seconds, followed by a resumption of normal feed. Hale felt a slow tightening in his chest, not fear, but the sharpening focus that came when a pattern began to emerge. Camera interruptions did occur, but they were logged automatically with maintenance codes or technical notes. No such notation appeared here. He asked quietly for the maintenance register. The officer scrolled through it, frowning slightly. There had been no scheduled work on that corridor's surveillance systems. Hale thanked him and stepped away from the console, allowing the officer to resume his duties, but he remained nearby, studying the corridor itself. The air felt cooler here, drawn from the stone walls, carrying the faint scent of polish and distant heating pipes. Everything appeared orderly, undisturbed, and that orderliness was precisely what troubled him. Errors left traces, misplaced items, hurried departures, fragments of explanation, but this absence of evidence suggested something more deliberate, a quiet removal of responsibility rather than a careless lapse. Hale pressed his cuff tab again, this time requesting a cross-check of personnel assignments issued that morning, and waited, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the palace continuing its routines as if nothing at all had nearly gone wrong. The personnel records arrived 10 minutes later, transmitted to the secure display in the guard office. Hale read them slowly, line by line, forcing himself not to rush, because accuracy mattered more now. At 0950, a temporary reassignment order had redirected one nursery attendant to assist with preparations in a reception hall. The authorization code attached to the order was valid in structure, but unfamiliar in sequence, as if generated from a terminal outside the usual administrative offices. At 10:05, a second instruction reassigned the remaining attendant to accompany a delivery inventory check in another wing, leaving the escort officer as the sole supervisor of the nursery until the next shift. That, in itself, was not a violation. A single escort could maintain supervision for short intervals, but the escort's own movement log showed departure at 10:12, citing instructions to report to a security briefing that Hale knew had never taken place. The chain of responsibility had not broken at one point. It had been dismantled step by step, each link removed under the appearance of proper authorization. Hale felt a quiet weight settle over him as the realization formed. This was not negligence. Negligence was chaotic, inconsistent, often accompanied by hurried apologies and incomplete records. What he was seeing was orderly, deliberate, and carefully documented to appear legitimate. He requested verification of the authorization codes, and the reply came back slowly, as if the administrative office itself needed time to understand the question. One code corresponded to a temporary terminal in a secondary records room, a location rarely used except during archival audits. The other returned no registered origin at all, existing in the system without a traceable source. Hale stood for a long moment, absorbing the implication that someone within the palace had not only redirected staff, but had done so with enough knowledge of procedure to conceal their actions behind routine entries. Outside the narrow window of the guard office, the winter light had shifted, becoming colder, the shadows longer along the inner courtyard stones. The palace continued its measured pace, footsteps in distant corridors, the mudded closing of doors, the low murmur of voices carrying faintly through ventilation shafts. Yet beneath that calm surface, Hale sensed a current of unease beginning to move. A message arrived instructing him to forward his observations through standard reporting channels and await review, the language polite but unmistakably cautious, as if the matter were already being contained. Hale read the message twice, then looked back at the sequence of logs, the missing camera footage, the fabricated briefing order, and the memory of a child sitting alone in a silent room. He understood that the pressure to treat the incident as administrative would grow stronger with each hour, and that the truth, if it was to be preserved, would require more than routine reporting.
He closed the display, stepped back into the corridor, and began walking toward the senior command offices, aware that each step carried him further from the comfort of procedure and closer to a confrontation that many within the palace would prefer to avoid.
The senior command offices were quieter than the outer administrative corridors, the air cooler, the lighting softer, designed to maintain composure rather than activity. Hale slowed his pace as he approached, aware that bringing concerns directly to higher authority without passing through intermediate review would be noticed and not always welcomed. Yet the sequence of events he had uncovered left little room for hesitation. The duty adjutant received him with formal courtesy, though the guarded expression in the man's eyes suggested he already knew why Hale had come. Hale presented his findings in concise, precise terms: the unsupervised interval, the falsified reassignment orders, the interrupted camera feed, the escort briefing that had never occurred. He avoided speculation, stating only what could be verified, and placed the compiled logs on the desk for review. The adjutant listened without interruption, then exhaled slowly and explained that Prince William had already been informed of the initial nursery incident through routine channels. A request had been made to review all relevant security recordings, but several senior administrators were advising caution. Raw surveillance footage, they argued, often revealed more than the immediate incident: security layouts, response patterns, vulnerabilities that, if circulated even internally without control, could create risks of their own. Hale understood the reasoning. He had been trained in the same principles. Yet the calm, measured tone of the adjutant carried an undercurrent of reluctance, as though the concern was not only about security exposure, but about what the recordings might show. Within the hour, Hale was instructed to accompany the adjutant to a private conference room where the preliminary briefing would be presented. The room was modest, paneled in dark wood, with a single long table and a wall display prepared for secure playback. Prince William entered quietly, without ceremony, acknowledging those present with a brief nod before taking his seat. Hale observed him carefully, noting the stillness in his posture, the focused attention that suggested he was listening not only to the words being spoken, but to what remained unsaid. The briefing began with a summary of the timeline delivered by a senior administrator who emphasized procedural irregularities but avoided any direct suggestion of deliberate interference. When Hale's compiled logs were presented, the administrator paused slightly, then continued, framing the matter as an anomaly under investigation. Prince William asked only a few questions, each precise: the exact duration of the unsupervised interval, the verification status of the authorization codes, the reason the camera interruption had not been flagged automatically. The answers were careful, incomplete, and at times qualified with phrases that deferred certainty. Hale felt a quiet tension building in the room, not confrontational, but unmistakable, as if the truth were present, but being approached indirectly. At last, Prince William turned his attention to Hale and asked in a calm voice whether he believed the recordings themselves were necessary to understand what had occurred. Hale felt the weight of the room settle on him in that moment, the awareness that his answer would carry consequences beyond a single incident. Hale chose his words with care, aware that he was speaking not only to a member of the royal family, but to the structure of authority that governed the palace itself. He stated that the logs and reports established a sequence of events, but only the recordings could confirm the circumstances in which those events occurred: who entered the corridor, how long the nursery remained unattended, and whether any other individuals had been present during the interval. Without that confirmation, conclusions would remain provisional, and any corrective measures might address only the surface of the problem. The room remained silent for several seconds after he finished. One of the administrators shifted slightly, then reiterated the risks of unrestricted access to surveillance material, suggesting a summarized technical review might suffice. Prince William listened, his expression unchanged, then asked a single question: whether a summary prepared without direct review could omit details that later proved significant. The administrator acknowledged that possibility, though reluctantly. The decision that followed was measured rather than dramatic. Prince William directed that all recordings and access logs relevant to the nursery and adjoining corridors be assembled for restricted review under his authority, with Hale present as the reporting officer. The instruction was delivered calmly, without raised voices, yet its effect on the room was immediate. Several of the administrators exchanged brief glances, the subtle kind that revealed concern more clearly than open objection. The meeting concluded shortly afterward, and Hale was escorted to the secure viewing room where the footage would be prepared. As he waited, the quiet hum of the equipment and the faint vibration of ventilation ducts filled the silence, and he became aware of a new form of pressure, not resistance in words, but in delay. The technicians moved carefully, methodically, double-checking authentication steps that normally took seconds, but now stretched into minutes. No one refused the order, no one openly obstructed it, yet the pace of compliance carried a quiet reluctance, as if each person involved understood that once the recordings were viewed, the matter could no longer be contained within routine explanations. Hale stood near the darkened screen, hands clasped behind his back, listening to the soft clicks of the system initializing. He thought of the nursery, of the stillness in the room, of the cold tea and the open logbook, and of the child who had sat alone in silence while a carefully constructed sequence of instructions removed every adult meant to protect him. When at last the first frame of the corridor footage appeared on the screen, frozen in the pale light of morning, Hale felt the certainty settle in his mind that whatever they were about to see would not only explain what had happened, but reveal why it had been allowed to happen at all. The recording began without sound, the corridor appearing in the muted gray tones of the surveillance system, time-stamped in the corner with precise, indifferent accuracy. Hale watched from a standing position behind the viewing table, aware of Prince William seated several feet away, the administrators arranged along the side wall, and the technicians operating the playback console in near silence. The first minutes showed nothing unusual. Attendants moving through the passage, the escort officer arriving at the scheduled time, the ordinary rhythm of duty exchanges that occurred dozens of times each week. Then, at 0950, one attendant checked a handheld device, paused, and spoke briefly to the escort before leaving the frame. The escort remained, posture composed, attention directed toward the nursery door. 4 minutes later, the second attendant received a similar message and departed in the opposite direction. Hale felt a faint tightening in his jaw. The escort officer now stood alone exactly as the logs had indicated, but the next sequence revealed something the written records had not conveyed. At 10:11, a uniformed staff supervisor approached the escort and spoke to him at length. There was no visible urgency, no raised voices, only a calm, deliberate conversation. The supervisor handed over a document, waited while the escort read it, and then gestured down the corridor. After a moment's hesitation, brief but unmistakable, the escort left his post and followed. The nursery door remained closed, the corridor empty, the camera recording the stillness with mechanical indifference. Hale felt the quiet weight of that image settle over the room. Protocol allowed temporary reassignment under proper authority, but it also required verification that another responsible adult was present before a post involving a child could be vacated. No such verification appeared in the footage. The minutes that followed were longer than they should have been, the corridor remaining empty, the nursery door closed, the silence on the screen reflecting the silence Hale had heard when he first approached the room. One of the administrators shifted in his chair, and Hale sensed the discomfort spreading through those present, not from the sight of misconduct, but from the realization that the lapse had been procedural, almost ordinary in its execution. At last, the screen advanced to the moment Hale himself appeared in the frame, walking down the corridor, pausing and turning toward the nursery door. The recording was stopped there. The technician looked toward Prince William, awaiting instruction. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Hale understood that what they had seen so far confirmed a breach, but not yet its cause. The supervisor who had removed the escort had acted with apparent authority, and the system had accepted that authority without challenge. The question was whether that authority had been legitimate or merely tolerated because it was convenient. The next recording began, this one drawn from a different corridor camera positioned near the secondary records room. The timestamp aligned with the authorization codes Hale had traced earlier. The footage showed the same supervisor entering the room alone, closing the door behind him, and remaining inside for nearly 6 minutes. When he emerged, he carried a tablet and paused in the corridor to transmit several messages before continuing on his way. The sequence was quiet, almost mundane, yet it carried the unmistakable implication that the reassignment orders had originated there. A technician overlaid the access logs on the screen, confirming that the terminal inside the records room had generated the instructions that redirected the attendants and the escort. One of the administrators spoke at last, suggesting that the supervisor may have believed the reassignment was harmless, a temporary adjustment made to address competing duties. Hale listened, but his attention remained fixed on the still image of the nursery corridor, empty and still, now displayed beside the records room footage. Harmless decisions did not leave children alone. Harmless adjustments did not require camera feeds to be interrupted for nearly 4 minutes, a fact revealed when the technicians restored the missing segment. The interruption itself had been created manually, not by technical fault, using an override function intended only for maintenance testing. The room grew noticeably colder, or perhaps it only felt that way as the implications settled over those present. Reporting these findings formally would not only implicate the supervisor, but would also expose a practice that had quietly developed over time. Small procedural shortcuts accepted because they made schedules easier, because they allowed staff to adapt without filing lengthy justifications, because nothing serious had gone wrong until now. Hale understood the pressure that would follow. There would be suggestions to describe the incident in narrow terms, to emphasize individual error rather than systemic tolerance, to correct the immediate lapse without examining the habits that had made it possible. Hale felt the familiar weight of protocol pressing against another obligation, one less written but no less real, the duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. When Prince William asked for his assessment, Hale spoke without raising his voice, stating only that the evidence showed a chain of decisions, each considered minor at the time, that together had removed every safeguard for a child who depended entirely on those safeguards. Silence followed, not the uneasy silence of uncertainty, but the heavy stillness of recognition. Hale knew then that documenting everything without omission or softening would disrupt established routines and damage reputations, perhaps even his own standing among colleagues who preferred matters handled quietly. Yet as Hale again looked at the paused image of the nursery corridor, empty and still, He understood that the greater failure would be to allow the same silence to settle over the truth. The formal report took 3 days to complete, longer than most internal reviews, not because the facts were unclear, but because every detail had to be verified beyond dispute. Hale worked in a quiet office adjacent to the security archives, the air cool and faintly dry from the constant climate control that preserved paper records and digital storage alike. He reconstructed the timeline minute by minute, cross-referencing logs, camera frames, and personnel assignments, ensuring that no assumption appeared where evidence was required. The process was methodical, almost clinical, yet the memory of the nursery remained present in his mind, not as an emotion that distracted him, but as a steady reminder of why precision mattered. Several times during those days, administrators requested interim summaries, suggesting that a shorter report might allow reforms to be implemented more quickly. Hale understood the practicality of the suggestion, but he also understood how summaries could narrow attention, how omissions made for efficiency could later become omissions of responsibility. He continued the full documentation, recording not only the actions of individuals, but the procedural habits that had allowed those actions to pass unquestioned. When the report was finally submitted, it moved through the review process with unusual speed, not publicly discussed, not circulated beyond a small circle of authority. Meetings were held in closed rooms, schedules adjusted quietly, and within a week, new escort protocols were issued. Every custody transfer involving a child now required dual confirmation, both digital and physical, with random supervisory checks built into the rotation. Surveillance overrides were restricted to a smaller group of technicians, and every interruption of a camera feed required immediate logging and independent verification. The changes were announced in routine memoranda, written in neutral language that referred only to procedural refinement, without reference to the incident that had prompted them. To anyone outside the security structure, the palace routines appeared unchanged. Yet Hale noticed the difference immediately in the corridors. Escorts lingered a moment longer at handoffs, attendants confirmed instructions twice instead of once, and the quiet assumption that minor shortcuts were acceptable began to fade. The system had adjusted, not dramatically, but decisively. One afternoon, while passing the nursery corridor, Hale paused briefly outside the same door he had opened days before. The faint sound of laughter drifted from within, the ordinary, unremarkable sound of a child at ease. He did not enter, and he did not remain long, but the sound stayed with him as he resumed his patrol, a quiet confirmation that the purpose of all those procedures was not the preservation of order for its own sake, but the protection of moments like that. The supervisor, whose decisions had set the chain of events in motion, was reassigned, pending further administrative review, the announcement delivered without public explanation. Among the staff, there was little open discussion, only a subdued awareness that something significant had occurred beneath the surface of routine. Hale sensed, at times, a subtle distance from certain colleagues, not hostility, but the guarded reserve that followed any disruption of established practice. He accepted it without comment. The role of a royal guard was not to seek approval, and the quiet reforms now taking shape throughout the palace confirmed that the discomfort had not been without purpose. Weeks later, during an evening patrol, Hale found himself again in the west corridor, the lamps casting long, steady lines of light across the polished floor. The palace was settling into the calm of night, distant doors closing softly, footsteps fading one by one until the silence returned, deep and measured. He paused near a window overlooking the inner courtyard, the winter air beyond the glass clear and cold, and allowed himself a moment of stillness. The events of the past weeks had already begun to recede into routine, absorbed into revised procedures and updated training materials, their urgency replaced by the steady rhythm of daily duty. Yet one memory remained vivid, the sight of a child sitting alone in a quiet room, trying not to cry, surrounded by a system that for a brief and dangerous interval had forgotten its purpose. Hale understood that vigilance was not sustained by orders or reports alone, but the quiet, persistent awareness that every rule existed for a reason, and that the absence of attention, even for a few minutes, could carry consequences far beyond what anyone intended. He resumed his patrol, footsteps measured, posture composed, the corridor stretching ahead in calm, even light. Nothing in the palace appeared different to an outside observer, and perhaps that was as it should be. The reforms would remain largely invisible, the incident unspoken, the lessons absorbed into practice rather than recorded in history. But for Hale, the memory of that quiet crying in the nursery had become something permanent, a silent measure against which every future decision would be judged, and a reminder that the duty of a royal guard was not only to stand watch, but to notice when something, however small, was not as it should be.